I never believed in things that went bump in the night. Growing up on a farm in the middle of nowhere, you get used to the sounds, the creaks of old barns settling, the rustling of wind in the crops, the distant howls of coyotes under the moon. But there's a difference between the usual farm sounds and something else. Something that I couldn't explain. It was the kind of place where you worked from dawn until dusk, the land stretched for miles in every direction, with no one around for miles. My family didn't have much, but we had the farm, and that's where we spent our lives. My father, James, always said the land had a spirit, and you had to respect it. It wasn't a joke, it was the truth. Or so he said. But I didn't understand what he meant until that summer night in 2006. It started small, like most bad things do, just a strange smell. At first, it was faint, like wet earth after a heavy rain, but it wasn't that pleasant kind of smell. It made me nauseous. I'd gone out to the barn late that evening to check on the horses when I noticed it, but it wasn't the barn. The smell was coming from the woods that bordered the farm. I tried to shake it off as just my imagination. The woods were dense, and if there was anything there, it was probably just some animal carcass rotting away. But my gut told me something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was watching me. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it. A low, guttural growl that echoed through the stillness of the night. My heart pounded in my chest. At first, I thought it was one of the dogs, but then I realized that our dogs never sounded like that. They weren't that low. It was something else. Something bigger. I should have told my dad. I should have said something. But I didn't. The next morning, I woke up to find the barn door wide open. I couldn't remember leaving it that way, and no one else had been out there. The horses were skittish, more so than usual, and they were all huddled together in the far corner of their stalls. Something wasn't right. That was the first time I thought about the warnings my father had given me about the land. He'd told me to respect it, to never take it for granted. He'd told me there were things on that farm that weren't quite human. I didn't believe him back then. But that night, when I walked into the woods alone to investigate the source of the smell, I would learn that my father wasn't just telling stories. I shouldn't have gone into the woods that night. But the curiosity was too strong, and I thought maybe I could prove my dad wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy jacket, figuring I'd just take a quick walk to calm my nerves. It was a crisp night, and the air felt heavier than usual. The moon hung high above, casting long shadows across the dirt path that led into the woods behind the farm. As I ventured deeper, the air thickened. The smell was stronger now, a putrid stench that seemed to cling to the very air around me, making each breath harder to take. It was almost like something was rotting, but there was no sign of any dead animal. The trees towered over me like silent sentinels, their twisted branches blocking out much of the moonlight. The ground beneath my boots was soft, wet, as though something had been disturbing it, something heavy. The flashlight's beam flickered as I moved further in. A shiver ran down my spine, and I glanced over my shoulder. The feeling of being watched was intense. I couldn't shake the sensation that something, or someone, was just out of sight, following me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I stopped in my tracks when I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. A shadow, too dark to be real. But then it moved. I froze, heart hammering in my chest. The shadow didn't belong to a tree or any animal I knew. It was tall, much taller than any person could be, and it seemed to shift, its shape distorting as it crawled along the ground. I backed away slowly, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but my legs wouldn't obey. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from it. The shape moved closer, and the air grew even colder. A sudden, sharp gust of wind swept through the trees, and in that instant, I heard it, a low growl, just like the one from the night before. I wasn't alone. Something was in the woods with me. I turned and bolted, my flashlight now useless as it flickered out. The ground seemed to rise up to meet me with every step I took. I stumbled over roots and rocks, my breath ragged, as the sound of something following me grew louder. The growl came again, closer this time, like it was right behind me, its breath hot on the back of my neck. I didn't dare look back. My only thought was to get to the edge of the woods and back to the safety of the farm. My lungs burned with each step, and just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I broke through the trees and into the open field. I collapsed, gasping for air, my heart thundering in my chest. The woods were still, as if nothing had ever happened. But I knew better. The night after I ran out of the woods felt like it was dragging on forever. My heart wouldn't stop racing, and I kept imagining those shadows, those eyes watching me from the darkness. But the strangest part. The next morning, the smell was gone. The woods seemed normal again, and there was no trace of anything unusual. I convinced myself it was just a trick of the mind, something my nerves had cooked up after a long day. But something inside me told me that wasn't true. No matter how much I tried to push it out of my head, the memory of that presence, the feeling of being hunted, refused to leave. That morning, I went about my usual chores. The horses were quieter than usual, though. They barely made a sound, just stood there, staring at the barn door with wide, nervous eyes. I tried to brush it off, but the tension was thick, like the whole place was holding its breath. That afternoon, as the sun began to set, my father called me over to the edge of the field. He didn't look like himself, there was something in his eyes, something sharp and unsettling. I thought he was just tired, worn out from the long hours, but when he spoke, his voice was different. "Stay away from the woods, son," he said, his voice low, almost a whisper. "I've told you before. It's not a place you should be wandering." I wanted to ask him why, to demand an explanation, but I already knew he wouldn't give me one. He was a man of few words, especially when it came to things he couldn't explain. I'd heard the stories when I was younger, the ones he used to tell around the dinner table about strange creatures that roamed the land long before we came here. Stories about things that hid in the trees, things that walked on two legs but weren't quite human. But those were just stories, right? That night, as I sat alone in my room, I heard a sound that sent a chill through me, a tap, tap, tap on the window. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it again. Someone, or something, was tapping on the glass, rhythmic and deliberate. I grabbed the flashlight and crept over to the window, my hands trembling. I opened the blinds just enough to peer outside. At first, I saw nothing but the darkness of the yard, the faint glow of the barn lights. But then I noticed them. Eyes. Dozens of eyes, glowing faintly from the trees. They were watching me. I stepped back, heart hammering. The tapping stopped, but the eyes stayed there, unmoving, unblinking. I couldn't tear myself away from them. There was something wrong about them, too many, all the same shade of pale yellow, like they belonged to a creature that wasn't supposed to exist. I grabbed my phone and ran downstairs to my father, but when I told him, he just shook his head. He didn't seem surprised. "I told you to stay away from the woods," he said, as though he'd been expecting this. "They're watching you now." I didn't understand what he meant. Not yet. The next few days felt like something out of a nightmare, but no matter how hard I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, I knew it wasn't. The woods weren't just a place, they were a presence. And it wasn't just me who noticed it. Our neighbor, Derek, had been working on his farm a few miles down the road. He was a solid, reliable guy, the kind of man who would give you the shirt off his back if you needed it. But one afternoon, he came over to our place looking shaken. His face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. "I need help," he said, his voice tight. "I went out to check the fence by the north field. I swear, something was out there. It wasn't an animal." He was breathing heavily, his hands trembling as he spoke. "I saw something move between the trees. Tall. Too tall to be anything normal. It was like it was waiting for me. I could see the fear in his eyes. This wasn't a joke. Derek wasn't one to make up stories. "We should call the sheriff," I suggested, but he shook his head. "That won't help," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "They'll think I'm crazy. They won't believe me, just like they didn't believe Old Man Harris." Old Man Harris? I didn't know the man personally, but I'd heard stories about him. He used to live on the farm at the far end of the road. Folks said he went mad a few years back, started babbling about strange creatures and things watching him from the woods. Everyone thought it was just his old age catching up with him. Derek's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Harris disappeared last year. Nobody knows what happened to him, but they say it was those things. The ones that live in the woods." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. I hadn't wanted to believe it, but now I could see it. The fear was real. Whatever was in those woods was something that could drive a man to madness, to vanish without a trace. That night, as the sun set and the darkness crept in, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen. The air was heavy, the smell from the woods thick once again, and I could hear the faintest of rustlings, like something was moving just out of sight. I didn't sleep at all that night. My eyes darted to every shadow, every flicker of movement, but nothing came close. Then, early the next morning, the news hit. Derek was gone. He'd left his house before dawn, just like he did every day, but this time, he didn't come back. His truck was parked at the edge of the north field, engine still running, doors wide open. There was no sign of struggle, no trace of what had happened to him. Except for one thing. A trail of deep, dragging marks in the dirt that led straight into the woods. My heart stopped when I saw them. They weren't human marks. They were too wide, too uneven, as though something huge and heavy had dragged itself across the earth. I turned to my father, but he just looked at me with those same haunted eyes, the ones I had seen the night he told me about the woods. "I warned you," he said, voice hollow. "You never listen. Now it's coming for you." I didn't know what he meant by that, but I wasn't stupid enough to ignore the truth anymore. Whatever was out there wasn't just watching. It was hunting. The days after Derek disappeared felt like a slow descent into madness. The farm seemed quieter, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. I didn't dare go near the woods anymore, but it didn't matter. The feeling of being watched never left. It was as if the forest had stretched its tendrils out and wrapped them around every part of our lives. But then, one night, something changed. I was in the barn, trying to distract myself from the growing sense of dread, when I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, crunching through the dry grass outside. It was too loud to be an animal, too methodical to be a person. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I couldn't see anything through the barn's small, dirty window, but I could hear it clearly. The steps came closer and closer, until they were right outside. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. Then it stopped. For what felt like an eternity, everything was silent. But I could still feel it, something was there, just out of sight. Watching. Suddenly, the barn door creaked open, slow and heavy. I rushed to lock it, but it was too late. The door pushed open with ease, as though it had never been locked in the first place. I grabbed a pitchfork, my hands trembling, and stepped into the doorway, praying it was just an animal. But I couldn't have been more wrong. Standing in the open field, illuminated by the dim moonlight, was a figure. It wasn't human, not by a long shot. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with long limbs that bent at unnatural angles. Its skin was pale, sickly, stretched tight over its bones. And its eyes, those eyes, were the same pale yellow as the ones I'd seen in the trees. I could hardly breathe as it stared at me. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, just stood there, watching. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like some invisible force was holding me in place. Then, without warning, it lunged. I didn't see it coming. One moment, it was standing there, the next, it was right in front of me. It was impossibly fast. I barely managed to raise the pitchfork in defense before it knocked me aside like I was a ragdoll. I hit the ground hard, the breath knocked out of me. I scrambled to my feet, gasping for air, but it was already too late. The creature was on me again, its sharp claws extending toward my throat. I could feel its rancid breath on my skin, its foul stench overwhelming my senses. In that moment, I thought I was done for. But then, something strange happened. The creature stopped. Its eyes flicked to something behind me, and it growled low in its throat. I didn't dare look, too terrified to take my eyes off the thing in front of me. But whatever it was that caught its attention, it was enough. Slowly, reluctantly, it stepped back, its yellow eyes lingering on me one last time before it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't stick around to figure out what had happened. I ran, faster than I'd ever run in my life, straight to the house. I didn't stop until I was inside, the door slammed shut behind me. My father was waiting for me in the kitchen, his face grim. "They found Derek's body this morning," he said quietly. But it wasn't him anymore. I stared at him, heart pounding, but he didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. I already knew. The thing that had taken Derek wasn't done yet. It was still out there, and now it knew who I was. It knew my name. The next few days passed in a haze of fear and disbelief. The farm, once a place of routine and hard work, had turned into a prison. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind, every shadow felt like a warning. My father, once so calm and sure of himself, seemed like a different person. His eyes were clouded with worry, and his movements were stiff, like he was always bracing for something. He didn't talk much after Derek's disappearance. He didn't need to. I could see the knowledge in his eyes, the same knowledge that had terrified him for years, the knowledge he tried so hard to keep from me. We weren't alone on this land. And we never had been. That night, I found the old journal. It had been hidden away in my father's study, buried beneath a pile of dusty old farming books and papers. I knew better than to pry, but my curiosity got the better of me. As I opened the worn leather cover, I immediately recognized the familiar handwriting. It was my father's, though the words inside were different. The first entry was short, but it made my blood run cold. "They're watching again. I can feel them in the woods. I can hear their whispers on the wind. They're growing bolder." I flipped through the pages, each entry growing darker. My father had been documenting the things in the woods for years, decades, in fact. The creatures that lived there, the ones that never truly left. He had always been afraid that they would come for us, but he had never shared this with me. The old man, Harris, knew too much. I could see it in his eyes before he disappeared. They took him. They're coming for me now. I shuddered. Harris, the man who had once lived down the road. I had thought he had just gone crazy, but the truth was much worse than that. The journal told stories of the things that lived in the woods, things that weren't quite human, things that could be seen in the corner of your eye, or heard on the wind, but never fully understood. They were ancient, older than anything my father had told me, older than the farm itself. The more I read, the more I realized just how deep my father's fear went. He had known what the land was capable of, he had known the dangers we faced every time we stepped outside. And now, it seemed the creatures had grown tired of waiting. They weren't just lurking anymore. They were hunting. I closed the journal with trembling hands, my mind spinning. This wasn't just about us anymore. This was a war for the land itself. The clock struck midnight as I sat in the study, the journal still open in front of me. That was when I heard it. A knock. It was faint at first, so soft I almost convinced myself it was my imagination. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap. 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 I rushed to the window and looked out. The moon was full, casting an eerie light over the yard, but I saw nothing at first. Just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. And then I saw it. The same pair of yellow eyes. They were watching me from the edge of the woods, hidden among the trees. I froze, my blood turning to ice. They were back. It wasn't just one. There were several pairs of eyes now, glowing faintly in the dark. And they were getting closer. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the window, my breath shallow. The tapping had stopped, but the eyes were still there, unblinking. I didn't wait for them to get any closer. I grabbed the shotgun my father kept locked away in the closet and rushed to the front door, my hands shaking. When I opened it, I almost wished I hadn't. Standing in the doorway was my father, but not my father. His face was pale, his eyes wide and glazed over, and his mouth hung open, like he was in a trance. But the worst part was his posture. It was wrong. His body was stiff, unnatural, as though something else was controlling him. Before I could react, he spoke. His voice was low and hollow, like it wasn't his own. "They're coming for you, son," he whispered. "You can't stop it." The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I heard it then, the unmistakable sound of something moving through the woods, fast and heavy. I could feel it in my bones. Whatever had taken my father's body was out there, waiting. And it was coming for me next. I couldn't breathe. The world seemed to shrink down to nothing but the figure standing at my doorstep, my father's body, but not my father. And the sound from the woods was growing louder, closer. I had no choice now. I couldn't escape. Not with whatever had taken hold of my father, and certainly not with the things in the woods. I backed away from the door, the shotgun gripped tightly in my hands. My father, or whatever was wearing his skin, took a slow step forward, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. "They're coming, son. You're too late." I couldn't let it speak any longer. I had to stop it. I raised the shotgun, aimed, and fired. The sound of the blast echoed through the night, and I saw the figure lurch back, stumbling. But it didn't fall. It didn't even flinch. It just stood there, its eyes locked on mine, glowing like embers. And that's when I realized the truth. Whatever was controlling my father wasn't just some creature from the woods. It was something older, something that had always been there, hidden beneath the soil, beneath the roots of the trees. It was a force of nature itself, something that couldn't be killed with a simple shot. The wind howled louder now, the trees shaking violently. The ground beneath my feet began to tremble. And then, I heard it, the sound of movement from all around, from the very earth itself. Something was rising, something massive. I turned to see the trees parting, their roots pulling free from the soil as if the land was trying to swallow everything in its path. I didn't know how long I had left, but I knew one thing: I couldn't fight this. I couldn't defeat it. But maybe, just maybe, I could survive. I turned and ran. I didn't look back. The shotgun was useless now, the sound of the creatures approaching grew louder with every step I took. I knew what I had to do. My father had warned me. He had tried to prepare me, even if I hadn't understood until now. I ran for the edge of the property, for the only place I knew I might be able to escape, the old root cellar beneath the barn. As I reached the door to the cellar, I glanced back one final time. The figure of my father was standing still, staring at me from the porch. Its eyes never left me, but it didn't move. Not yet. Whatever was controlling it was waiting for me to make a mistake. I threw open the cellar door and scrambled down into the darkness. The smell of damp earth and mildew hit me hard, but I didn't care. I had to hide. I had to survive. I slammed the door shut behind me, and for a moment, there was silence. I thought maybe, just maybe, I had made it. But then I heard it. The tapping. Soft at first, like fingers on wood. Then louder. It was coming from above, from the floor of the barn, where the creatures were surely circling. I pressed myself against the cold stone wall, trying to steady my breath, but the tapping continued, rhythmic and deliberate. I don't know how long I stayed there, listening, waiting. The hours passed in a blur, each second stretching on forever. The tapping never stopped. The eyes never left. I could feel them, even now. Even here. But the one thing that I know is this: I'm still alive. And I'm the last one left. I don't know if anyone will ever find me down here. I don't know if they'll ever understand what happened to the farm, to my father, to Derek. But if you're reading this, if you find this story, then you need to know one thing. The creatures in the woods are real. They've been here longer than we ever could understand. And they're always watching. And now, they're waiting for you.